Okay, let's get started. We're going to start running late, which the moderators will not tolerate. Okay, welcome to the second panel. My name is Gary Francione. I'll be moderating it. And the topic of the panel is animal agriculture and the law. And you know, as I was listening to the last panel and hearing various suggestions about what we can do to implement the moral principle that we think it's wrong to beat up on animals, I was thinking there's a simple answer to this. Just stop eating them. And that as long as we're killing 10 billion of them a year for food and have no better justification than they taste good, I think it's going to be hard for us to find our moral compass. So that's a good way, a good segue into the topic of the second panel. We're having a bit of a program change. We originally had David Wolfson, who's a partner at Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy in Manhattan, giving a separate presentation, and then he was going to join with Mariann Sullivan, who is Deputy Chief Court Attorney at the New York State Appellate Division, on another topic, on another presentation. They are only going to do one presentation. It's not clear to me how they're going to divide this up, but I'm sure they'll work it out.
It's not clear to us, actually.
Yes, it's not clear to them, and they're going to sort of be winging it. But they're going to be doing they're going to do one presentation, what's good for the goose. And then we'll have Jeff Leslie, who's an associate clinical professor at the University of Chicago, doing animal rights without controversy, with Cass Sunstein, who is not here. And so we'll just have Jeff Leslie. He'll actually join with Mariann and David and do animal rights without controversy. And we can ask him what's wrong with controversy. And Jeff Welty, who will do humane slaughter laws in theory and practice. So, David and Mariann, take it away.
Sure. We're going to stay down here because we figured we'd fight too much over the microphone if we went up there. I'm delighted to be here today. I actually am a graduate of Duke University undergraduate. I graduated from here in 1988. And if someone had told me that I would be, or rather that Duke Law School would be putting on a symposium like today, only 15 or 20 years after my graduation, I wouldn't have believed them. If they had said that it would be because, in part, that Bob Barker of The Price is Right had given them money to do it, I really wouldn't have believed them. Then if they told me Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor of California, and so on. But anyway, to say we are going to do a presentation together, which will be somewhat interesting. One of the things that we tend to do in private is argue all the time, so we'll probably just argue in front of everyone else, and you'll see how it goes. The subject of what we're talking about is farmed animal issues. Gary said what he said at the beginning, and I agree wholeheartedly, and he said it extremely well, and in a sense, part of me wants to just sit down now, because the whole issue of farmed animals is such a crazy one. I mean, the whole issue of animal protection and the inconsistencies of the way we treat animals is somewhat crazy. When you look at it for long enough, you start to wonder if you're going mad. Surely all of this cannot be happening. In the case of farmed animals, that's particularly true. No one has said, it's nice to be here with Gary so I can say this, no one has basically described the crazy inconsistencies in terms of how we interact with animals better than Gary. We have a very strange society. We take certain animals into our homes. We educate our children from day one to adore animals. We use animals as educational tools. Every book you read about for a child is using a cuddly animal to tell them how we should interact with people. And we now, some might argue, sort of obsess over some animals to an unbelievable extent, and we treat them, some of them very well. In a sense, we probably treat some of them a little too well, and they now have some of the problems that humans have who are treated a little too well in terms of being a little too big. But we do all of that, and yet at the same time, we treat animals that we eat when there really is no reason to eat them in the most horrible ways. And the numbers are truly staggering. When we try and talk about the numbers, I've tried so many different ways to try and get the number out there in a way that people will be able to hold for a while. The fact is every year in the United States, about 10 billion farmed animals are killed for food or in connection with food production. And 10 billion is just, you know, it just went by out the room, it's gone. You know, we try to do different ways of dealing with it, you know, 260 chickens a second. I mean, there are different ways of dealing with it, but the numbers are so horrendous, it's hard to comprehend. One of the things that we have done, which we seem to have made some impact, is try and put the issue of farmed animals in context with everything else. So, for example, if you were trying to aggregate what percentage of animals that we interact with farmed animals represent, so if you went out and you try to gather all the other animals that we interact with, and by interacting I tend to mean kill because that tends to be the way it goes. But for example, if you added all the animals we use in medical research and you added to that all the animals we raise for fur, all the animals we use in education, all the animals we use in dissection, all the animals that we kill in hunting, and then for the hell of it, you throw in all the animals that we keep as pets, cats and dogs, birds, and so on, and maybe add in all the animals that you can think of anywhere else. You just grab them all in zoos and circuses. You push them into one big pile, and then you add farmed animals to the group. That number, 98% of that number are farmed animals. So when you talk about issues relating to animals, and when you talk about issues relating to animal law, unfortunately, not that the other issues are not vitally important, because they are, but unfortunately the fact that 98% of that number are farmed animals is crucially important. And it's crucially important when it comes to legal issues, because how those animals are treated legally really means how animals in our society are treated. There may be some protections for some animals, but if 98% of all the animals are getting a really bad time of it, then I think that matters a lot.
And that's not even counting fish.
Yeah, that's not even counting fish. Now, briefly, just to put everything in context, people have referred to it earlier today. The US legal reality for farmed animals, I can do the talk in like an hour, I can do it in about 2 minutes. You're going to get the 2-minute version. The legal reality for farmed animals in the US is really, really bad. There are very few federal laws, i.e. pretty much 2 federal laws that relate to farmed animals, of which Jeff will be speaking about. One of them, the Humane Slaughter Act, which has a lot of significant issues, and a Transportation Act, which has significant issues. But there are no federal laws that relate to how animals are raised, what a farmer can do to an animal when the animal is being raised. For protection, you need to look at the states. And state anti-cruelty statutes fall into 2 categories. Categories that really can arguably have no meaning, as Gary has pointed out. On the one hand, you have states that have farming exemptions, common farming exemptions, which we talked about before, Bill talked about. And the majority of states in the United States today have common farming exemptions. What that simply means is that if any practice is common, you can't prosecute it. It doesn't matter how horrible it is, it doesn't matter how unjustified it is. If it's a common farming practices, that is it. The judges, the prosecutors, they can't do a thing. They just throw their hands up and say, well, I'm done with this. The rest of the statutes, which are criminal statutes, have a whole host of problems. They're very hard to enforce, they're very hard to prosecute, you have to prove criminal intent, but most importantly, they have, as Gary pointed out, the concept of justifiability. You are only found liable if you unjustifiably treat an animal a certain way. And most courts seem inclined at this time to read that any normal or common farming practice would be viewed as justifiable and therefore would not be prosecuted. And so what this means is that as a legal reality, farmers do whatever they want to farmed animals. 10 billion of them, 98% of all of our animals, every day without any legal prohibition. And as an animal lawyer, that's a rather depressing thing to recognize. The whole issue, I think, and this is one of the things that we've struggled with and one of the reasons we wrote about this topic in our paper, is that when you deal with farmed animal law, you really start to throw your hands up and start to wonder whether you should just put your pen down, leave the room, and start a vegan restaurant. You know, and I'm not making fun of Tammy for that because I think that's a very important thing. But the question becomes, this is such a big problem. What on earth can we do about it? And where do you start? How do you start? Of course, one of the basic problems about it is that the awfulness of the treatment is so embedded in every aspect of the production and it characterizes every single method of producing food that you can't selectively pull one thing out. You can't say, well, the gestation crate is really, really terrible. I mean, you can, but the problem with doing that is then you're sort of doing two things. One is you're in the position where you're ignoring every other awful farm animal cruelty, and how do we feel about that? Is that a good thing? The other is you're also saying, by the way, if you find that the gestation crate is cruel, you should also find that the veal crate is cruel, that the debeaking of chickens is cruel, that castrations are cruel, that mutilations are cruel, and you basically pull a little piece of string and you pull and you pull and you pull and you pull the whole thing down, which is unsurprisingly why whenever you deal with animal industries, particularly the farm animal groups, and you try and move anything, you try and move the peanut a millimeter, they fight it. They fight anything, because they know that the consistency is such that if you recognize that that practice is cruel, everything would have to go next. And this makes judges extremely unwilling to do things. I mean, a judge is very unlikely to prohibit all farming practices overnight, make something a violation of the criminal law that's being done everywhere. They're similarly disinclined to find a specific practice illegal when the possibility would be that someone would use that specific practice to prove that the next practice and the next practice and the next practice. And so you have a real state of legal paralysis for a whole host of reasons, economic reasons, societal reasons, and so on. And so our question is, well, what do we do about it? We need something different. How do we get there? Is the law relevant? Can the law be changed? Can the law be used in any way to change this? And we came across this opinion one day, the Israeli Supreme Court decision about 4 years ago. And what the Israeli Supreme Court did was they struck down regulations in a particular way, which we can talk about. They struck down regulations that had allowed the force feeding of geese to produce foie gras, which, as people probably know, foie gras is a delicacy, so-called delicacy. It's basically the result of a very over-fattened liver that grows to a huge size, way bigger than the normal size. Some people would argue a diseased liver that tastes good to some people. And in order to produce it, you have to constantly overfeed the animals. And in the way that they do it is arguably very cruel. And the Israeli agricultural body had passed regulations that endorsed the practice, and the Israeli Supreme Court struck it down. And we went, wow, that's interesting. Who would have thought? That sure as hell wouldn't have happened in the US. Let's go look at that opinion, and let's see if there is anything that we can find out about that opinion that would be of use to us in the United States. And it may be that there won't be anything of use, but we thought that it was worthwhile looking at. And I encourage anyone who has the opportunity to read the opinion, because it truly is a wonderful opinion. It talks about these issues in a way that no other court has ever talked about them. There's a discussion of animal rights, cites to Peter Singer, to Gary Francione, to a whole bunch of people. And it comes to a very interesting conclusion. The one problem with the conclusion, as we'll talk about, is that the reasoning in the judicial opinion is probably wrong. There's a basic illogical conclusion in that opinion that really doesn't make any sense, but that misthinking was essential to get to the result, which was to prohibit a particular form of cruel farming. And one of the problems we have in this issue is that if you have truly consistent ethical thinking applied to the law, you have to prohibit everything overnight. That doesn't seem very likely at this time. And so maybe we thought we should look at an example of a case that didn't apply consistent thinking, but in applying inconsistent thinking, actually ended up perhaps doing something that was positive.
I guess I should take over now.
Yeah.
I just want to mention, before talking about the opinion itself, that the foie gras industry in Israel was a big industry. This was not a completely marginal decision relating to a marginal practice. They were producing 500 tons of foie gras a year. It's an industry that had been promoted by the Ministry of Agriculture for about 40 years, and they had encouraged family farms to go into this. But also, it had also been the focus of a very active animal rights movement in Israel, and they had specifically focused on this. And so there were these countervailing cultural influences. As David said, regulations had been passed. This had been as a result of pressure brought by the animal rights movement, actually a lawsuit brought by the animal rights movement. The Ministry of Agriculture had enacted regulations just basically putting a few standards on how foie gras production was to be borne out. It was pretty much following the exact practices that the industry was already using, used European methods. They were approved by a committee of the Knesset. And then this lawsuit was brought. And by the way, if you do want to read it, it's available on a website. The name of the group is CHAI, Concern for Helping Animals in Israel. The decision is really interesting to read, and has amazing quotes, and they take the issue very seriously. They go into a lot of different factors. They spent a really amazing amount of time on this, considering the issue. It's unimaginable in the United States. But interestingly, the majority and the dissent, it was a 3-judge panel, to annul the regulations, 1 not to. For almost the entire decisions, they read very similarly, and it's not until the end of each decision that you realize that they're coming out differently. And the factors that they differed on, I think, are really interesting. For one, the crucial factor of finding a way, the whole topic that David has been talking about, finding a way to find that one thing isn't necessary without finding that the whole ball of wax, the whole of animal agriculture, isn't necessary. And the majority focused on the fact that foie gras is a luxury food and therefore not as necessary as other foods. I mean, I think anyone who's vegan thinks that's probably not true. None of it's necessary in any logical sense. But because the majority was willing to make that distinction, which is kind of arbitrary, the majority was able to come to a good decision in this particular case. Another difference between the majority and dissent is that the dissent felt very strongly that the law under which they were acting was a criminal statute. They had to find that this was criminal. It was very similar to our cruelty laws, just a very general statement that it's wrong to torture animals. And the majority was not, or the dissent was not willing to put this industry out of business tomorrow and call all of these Israeli farmers who had been following practices of the Ministry of Agriculture had encouraged them to do criminals in one day. And I think that's a hugely important factor for why these kinds of laws are so difficult to enforce against farmers. But the majority just said, well, we'll delay prosecution. I mean, we'll delay the annulment of the regulations for a couple of years, and we'll give them a chance to adjust their businesses. And this doesn't make any sense either. I mean, it's a crime. If it's a crime, if it's going to be a crime in 2 years, it's a crime now. And the dissent was very aware that that doesn't make sense. But again, the majority was willing to do something creative and consistent in order to come to the right result in this particular case. Some of the key factors in the decision was that they had this broad prescription of cruelty, which is the basis from which the court was acting. And they have but in addition to that, unlike the United States, other than in one place, New Jersey, they have a regulatory system which allows the Ministry of Agriculture to promulgate regulations that actually set standards for particular agricultural practices. And of course, that didn't solve the problem, since the regulations that were promulgated were very, very bad. But then they have judicial review, which is common in administrative law whenever there's a regulatory system. And they not only have judicial review, they have very, very generous, they're a much more generous legal system than ours in so many ways. It's so easy to see looking at this decision. The decision goes straight to the Supreme Court of Israel rather than a lower court first. They have the discretion to grant standing to almost anyone they think would be useful to hear from. So if an animal rights group wants to bring an action contesting the validity of these regulations, and they would be interested in hearing it, they can hear it. That is certainly not the case in the United States. And their standard of review was fairly generous. They just had to find that the regulations significantly deviated from the purpose of the law, and the purpose of the law was to prevent the suffering of animals. I think that looking at this decision, it's very encouraging. It makes one think that there are a lot of benefits to this particular type of system, that if we could get it in the United States, or if we could encourage its use, and it's already kind of been put into place in one state, perhaps this is a way forward. I mean, that would allow for some carving out of some of the worst practices in a gradual way to get at the worst problems in agribusiness. In theory, a regulatory system is generally, most people probably think there is a regulatory system governing the welfare of farm animals in this country because it makes perfect sense. It's the way these things usually go. It's the way that the legal system deals with problems that have a lot of stakeholders involved, that involve the examination of complex scientific issues. A regulatory system also allows for a lot of inconsistency, which is obviously necessary in getting at these problems and making these small changes in a monolithic juggernaut without having to change the whole thing. It can bring change in gradually. It can give people who are using these practices time to change. It can just deal with one practice without having to deal with taking, as David was saying, unraveling the whole ball of wax. There's no reason it has to be consistent. It can be proactive. It doesn't have to respond to a practice that's already in place. It can actually prevent something before it happens, and preventing people from putting their money into it. And perhaps most important, it can provide for an inspection system to make sure regulations are being enforced. Europe's regulatory system has made some inroads in factory farming practices, and as this decision shows, Israel's system, which is even a little closer to ours, has also done so. So the question is, could it work here? And probably not. But maybe. So it's at least worth looking at.
I mean, basically, when we came out of reading the case, we saw an example, and this is not, it's the same with the European Union. Whenever you discuss American, the United States, or Canadian law, you always say, well, you know, look at the great progress that's happened in the European Union or in Israel. The European Union has prohibited certain types of common farming practices. I want to point out that, you know, there's been great progress in the European Union as compared to the United States and Canada.
Well, as compared to the
United States and Canada, right. But that doesn't mean there actually has been great progress in the European Union. It's better there somewhat than it is here. So, and you look to those models, and you basically, as a farm animal, well, there are obviously many different ways you can try and approach the problem, but we tend to get stuck in 2 or 3 different ways. There are ways of affecting the consumer, you know, and people shouldn't eat these animals. People should be educated about buying the right products, and there should be some system of making sure that people know which are the right products to buy, which obviously Jeff and Casa will be talking about. Or you can try and, where Cass's presence will be talking about it, you can try and work under the anti-cruelty statutes that we have at the moment, which seems really, really, really hard. I don't have a great deal of hope at the moment for that. You can try and pass new legislation to specifically prohibit everything or something, and we can talk a little bit about that. There are good things about that. There are bad things about that. How real is it? I don't know. Or you can try and do maybe what they did in the European Union and Israel, which is to try and get a regulatory system, an administrative agency at a state or a federal level, overseeing all of farming and trying to incrementally change it bit by bit by bit. Would such a system work in the United States? Well, the one place we've seen something wouldn't lead us to feel very hopeful about it. The state of New Jersey decided about in 1996 to pass a law that exempted out of the cruelty statute any practices that had been approved by the Department of Agriculture as humane. And the Department of Agriculture was then told to go and promulgate a list of humane farming practices. Why they put the word humane in the New Jersey statute, I do not know. And unsurprisingly, even though the Department of Agriculture of New Jersey was given 6 months to draft these regulations, the New Jersey Department of Agriculture didn't. And that's because they were sitting there scratching their head going, well, if we really do this, and we actually only list humane farming practices in New Jersey, we're going to have to prohibit everything. So let's not do anything and see what happens. So 97, 98, 99, 2000, 2001, 2002, the animal protection group started knocking on their door saying, hey, we'd like to see these standards, we'd like to see these standards. And finally the standards came out. And unsurprisingly, one, the standards declared that every common farming practice under the sun was humane. Gestation crates, field crates, debeaking, forced malting, you know, you name it, they did it. And 2, just in case they missed something, which is, you know, the classic legal strategy, just in case you miss something, put in the catch-all, any other common or normal farming practices were also humane. So now, one of the basic arguments about having a regulatory structure is that when you have someone do something, they're meant to do it, and then when they do it wrong, you have an avenue of relief. So we went to the court, and we're trying to argue in front of the court that when they say the word humane in the statute, just like in Israel, we're meant to follow a humane statute. They didn't when they drafted these regulations. Can we get the same thing from the court? And you run into the obvious issues that I know a lot of people in this room are thinking. One, do you really want to give authority to make these decisions to an agency that seems to be somewhat biased? That's my generous way of looking at it. My maybe more cynical way would be captured by the industry themselves. Two, how do you review the decision when you end up being in a state court arguing about whether the agency acted arbitrarily or capriciously? Because that's the standard you're going to have to deal with. And so that gives the agency a great deal of leeway to say, well, look, it's a very complicated issue. Pigs in a gestation crate. Well, maybe it looks cruel, but if you measure their blood levels, they don't show that they're stressed. I mean, I know it seems strange to you, but in fact, it's not cruel at all. And one of the things that's happened in the last 5, 8, 10 years in the US in particular is there's been a development of a large amount of science created by the industry itself to justify every practice that it has, saying that, see, the science shows that these practices are not inhumane. So how likely is it that a court, when faced with an arbitrary standard, is going to do something about it, given all of these complexities? And really, how likely is it that a US court would be as creative as the Israeli Supreme Court in making up something that doesn't really make sense? It's a luxury, but whatever, and ignoring the fact that they don't want to phase it out now, they'll do it in the future, do all of these extra things to get to where we want. And this is why we usually start fighting, because we don't know. We're both somewhat cynical of it. The alternative, of course, if you don't do a regulatory approach, and we'll just wrap it up very quickly, is to try and take each practice on one by one. Let's ban the gestation crate. Let's ban the veal crate, which is basically what we've been doing.
What people have been trying to do. I mean, there are problems with that. It's a lot safer if you get it in a statute, but there are almost all the I mean, we have very few successes. That's the first problem. It's really hard to achieve. It's extremely expensive, state by state, legislature by legislature. They're almost always at the margins. I mean, foie gras, which in this country really is a very marginal industry, downers, cows that are unable to walk. Gestation crates are a little less at the margins, and the only way there's been any movement on that is the Florida ballot initiative, which banned gestation crates in the state of Florida, which took over $1 million. Hardly a recipe for the animal protection movement to keep going state by state. And also, they're very static. Once you get something, that's pretty much, you've passed a statute banning gestation crates. It's unlikely that legislature is going to be revisiting pig welfare in a long time. And also, they're very, very controversial. Almost always, to get a statute passed, you have to dilute industry opposition, because the industry is way more powerful than we are, by building in a lot of compromise. These kind of delays, often for a very long period of time, 6, 7, 8 years before the ban goes into effect, so that they can get rid of their current equipment. These are very controversial within the movement, and you tend to lose a lot of your grassroots support. So though these are a potential way forward, they are not a recipe for success in the grand scale. And so we have to come up with a conclusion to our article. It's not quite this despairing.
We just haven't written it down yet.
But a couple of one of the ways forward, obviously, is information-based strategies. I mean, there's been a couple of really nice successes with consumer protection litigation, in particular, compassion over killings action against United Egg Producers, which has resulted in the United Egg Producers having to stop using their animal care certified check on their members' boxes. And and consumer protection litigation can help bring attention to this problem, which obviously there are legal strategies in that direction. And Jeff is going to talk about one of the most important ones, is the idea of mandatory labeling. Unless you have anything more to add.
No, basically, I always apologize for being one of the most depressing speakers that I've ever met. But I'm dragging you down with me. Welcome to the world of farmed animal law. It's truly horrifying what is going on. It's truly astounding that the way we treat these animals that represent such a huge amount of the animals in this country that we interact with at this time have no legal protection of any worth whatsoever. And it's also, because it's so big, so truly, truly difficult to change. But obviously we have to change. And so what we're doing is scrabbling around trying to find some way to see if the law is practical here. Is there a role for the law in this context? Or maybe is it simply we need to educate people about veganism and vegetarianism, and we need to educate people, you know, there's something else that has to happen before the shift gets made. Or it's both, which tends to be the way it works. It's usually a little bit of everything. But obviously one very interesting strategy that we need to examine in more detail is the whole issue of information, access to information, which I think we can pass to Jeff.
Very good, thank you. So we've heard a lot today so far about the real disconnect between even mainstream moral intuitions about how we should treat animals and then our actual practices and how we actually do treat animals, particularly in the farm context. And I want to suggest that that disconnect may provide some real opportunities to bring about some tangible improvements in the situation for animals and farmed animals in particular, without having to resolve some of the really difficult, thorny, philosophical and moral questions about the ultimate status of animals, what an animal-friendly world would look like, and how do we get there. These are issues that are important and kind of long-term issues to decide. But I want to suggest that there are things that could be done in the interim, in a very immediate sense, that could improve the lot of farmed animals. So what would happen if meat producers were to compete against each other in terms of how well they treat animals in raising them for food? If you had chicken producers, say, advertising that, you know, buy our chicken not just because it's the freshest or it tastes good or it's good for you or reminds you of, you know, what mom used to cook at home, but also because we're cutting edge in terms of the humane farming practices that we employ relative to our competitors. And one perhaps optimistic outcome, but I don't think unrealistically optimistic, of such competition could be real improvements in farming practices and cause them to trend towards a more humane direction. Industry has shown a tremendous capacity for innovation, technological change, which has to date been geared towards making food, or meat products and animal products, cheaper and in some ways safer for humans to eat. What if we could use competition to channel that capacity for innovation towards more humane farming practices? Wouldn't that be a good thing? And how do we get there? So I want to further suggest that consumer-based disclosure may be one avenue for encouraging that kind of competition. Disclosure is increasingly used as a regulatory tactic in all kinds of situations, where regulators say, we're not going to tell you what to do, what not to do. We're going to require you to disclose what you're actually doing, and then we'll let other processes take their effect and do their work. So we see this, for instance, in the securities context. All kinds of disclosure rules in the offering and sale of securities, offering statements, annual reports that companies have to give out. And the purpose of those disclosures is to give investors the information that they need to make a sound investment. It's not saying that, you know, you have to structure your business a certain way, just tell us what you're doing. Similarly, in the toxics area, the toxic release inventory requires companies to disclose what toxics they're releasing into the environment. And the idea, again, is to rather than activating market processes, which is what the investment side, the security side is trying to do, it's trying to activate political processes. If people know what's being emitted into the environment, they can take informed action to try to mediate that or stop it, or et cetera. So how would this apply to factory farming and animal husbandry? We can take some lessons from disclosure regimes in other areas. We know now, having experimented enough with these things in other areas, what kinds of disclosure regimes tend to work and which kinds tend not to work. And there's sort of two facets for looking at this. You need to look at it from the audience side, the people who are receiving the disclosures, and then you need to look at it from the disclosure side, people who are making the disclosures. So first, from the audience side, it's quite clear and pretty intuitive, I think, that you need to have an audience out there to receive a disclosure that's interested in what's being disclosed. Do we have that for humane treatment of animals raised for food? And I submit that there's a lot of evidence to think that, yes, there is such an audience out there. The audience, the reason for suggesting that comes from some data that is assailable and may turn out not to be that reliable. It's difficult to say. They're primarily things like willingness to pay studies, where researchers go and convene focus groups or create these other kind of artificial studies where they say, here's a ham sandwich, and here's a ham sandwich that was raised, using humane methods of various kinds. How much more would you pay for this ham sandwich than the other ham sandwich? Artificial scenarios, but those studies tend to show, or many of those studies tend to show, people express a willingness to pay more for humanely raised products. Survey data is another source for this, where surveys consistently show that people, one, really have no clue about the horrific practices that go into factory farming now, and when they're told about those practices, are opposed to them, they say. And furthermore, that they express a willingness to, they say they would be willing to pay more for more humanely raised products. And then the other source of evidence for this is the fact that there is already some activity in this area, that both animal welfare, NGOs, and some industry groups have been experimenting in various ways and putting out animal products that they claim, with varying degrees of accuracy, I would say, that those products were raised more humanely. And there is market share for those products. It's pretty early to know how much that market share is growing, but the trend in the industry seems to be in that direction rather than away from it. So again, on the audience side, there seems to be a receptive audience to this kind of disclosure. Now, for an effective disclosure regime, you also have to have a discloser side where the disclosure is motivated to respond to the audience reaction. So if you're disclosing something, the audience hates it, but you as the discloser don't really care, you don't really need their support, that regime is not going to work. But clearly in food production, that's not the case. Food producers are sensitive to market share. It's a market-based economy. If consumers come back and say, if there's a demand for more humanely raised animal products, producers will surely attempt to respond to that. Furthermore, they would be able to respond to that. There's all kinds of producers that are experimenting with more humane techniques that have not been adopted by the more mainstream major producers that could be adopted by those folks. So on both the audience side and the disclosure side, there is potential for an effective disclosure regime that would make markets work better and improve the lot of animals. The main focus of our paper is, after we sort of explore what goes into making an effective disclosure regime, to talk about how this would translate in a very practical way into food and humanely raised farm animals. And the main focus that we are taking is to look at kind of the timing and format of the consumer-based disclosure that has to be done. It's clear from previous experience with disclosure regimes that if your disclosure is not hitting the audience in the right way, if it's not the information is not arriving at a way that kind of fits in with what consumers are, what the audience is already doing, what their pre-existing practices are and expectations are, that disclosure is not going to be effective. So our proposal is that you look at food labeling. Consumers are used to consulting labels when they buy food in the supermarket. They look at it for nutritional information. If they're interested in organic foods, they look at the label for that. They're not going to go look at a website or an annual report from a food producer or something to find out what the humane treatment standards that organization uses are. So looking at consumer-based disclosure in terms of labeling on the spot would be the most effective way, we say, of bringing about this kind of consumer demand for humanely raised products. And there's, of course, all kinds of issues with how you craft such a label. The label would have to be simple enough for consumers to understand. It couldn't be too long. And it would have to to address issues that are salient to consumers, that are important to consumers, and that they'll react to, and also criteria that will allow consumers to differentiate amongst producers. If you had a label that, say, disclosed practices, but then the whole industry was either in compliance or out of compliance with those standards, that doesn't allow consumers to pick and choose amongst producers and pick the ones that they feel are doing the appropriate amount of humane treatment. And that's going to be tricky to do, and it would no doubt involve a negotiated process with industry to come up with labeling criteria that would fit all of these different criteria. It may be that, I think it's likely that no label like that would be completely satisfactory to anyone. It would be it would meet somewhere in the middle between the consumer side and the producer side. Although that's a problem in some ways it's also a benefit, because what could result is, one, in this extended negotiation of what goes into the label, you would have much more public attention focused on the issue of humane treatment for farm animals than currently is the case. Furthermore, that negotiation would be long-term. The label could evolve over time. If you think about certain practices that are considered more humane today, may evolve into practices that we no longer think are so great. And this has been proven in different kinds of husbandry techniques, again and again, that what initially is thought of as humane later turns out to have all these problems, and we come up with better techniques. So the label could evolve over time, and there would be this ratcheting effect, potentially, where the humane standards would go up over time as our processes develop and as consumer demand develops in this area.
Well, our final speaker, Jeff Welty, one of the co-organizers of this symposium.
Thanks. I've got a couple of slides which we're going to put up eventually. What some folks on this panel have talked about, and there's been some attention to in the media and elsewhere, is how farmed animals are treated on the farm, the conditions under which they're raised or kept. And what I'm going to be talking about, as the very sophisticated first slide indicates, is actually the slaughter process of animals, what the end point of animal agriculture. And it's important for a couple reasons. First is just the number of animals that go through this process. As David and Mariann said, it's 10 billion animals each year in the United States, 9 billion of them poultry, and about 50 billion animals worldwide are slaughtered each year. But more than just the numbers, the slaughter process is also a sort of a critical stage for the animals. The day or so leading up to slaughter, when the animals are transported to the slaughterhouse, and then the period of slaughter itself is probably the time in the animal's life when it most experiences stress, fear, uncertainty, and pain. So it's a subject that's sort of worth focusing on. And what I wanted to do today is start by talking about the principal methods of commercial slaughter for a couple of species of animals that are regularly killed for food in the United States. Then talk a little bit about what legal regulation there is of the slaughter process, and then conclude with the discussion of some of the problems that we have and solutions that there might be for the problem. So I wanted to start first by talking about cattle. Cattle come normally to a slaughterhouse by truck, and they're unloaded into a holding pen until it's their time. And at that point, they're driven through a series of wooden chutes until they reach the first station on the cattle slaughter line, which is called the knocking station in the industry and the stunning station in the sort of academic literature about it. And they generally arrive at the stunning station. At that point, they've sort of been winnowed down until they're single file, so you've got one animal at a time. And in the old days, what happened at the knocking station was there was a slaughterhouse worker there with a sledgehammer, and he'd sledge the skull of the cow, hoping to knock it unconscious with one blow. As you can imagine, wielding a heavy sledge and with a mobile, conscious animal, that was not a 100% process. In fact, maybe up to 50% of the time, the first blow didn't do it, and repeated blows were required to bludgeon the cow into unconsciousness. So now we've got improved methods, far and away the most popular of which is the captive bolt gun. And the captive bolt gun is depicted here. What it is just a handgun powered either by compressed air or by a blank gunpowder cartridge. And you pull the trigger, you place it against the cow's skull, you pull the trigger, and a bolt is fired through the skull of the cow and into the brain. And that renders the animal unconscious and, in many cases, actually brain dead. It's not a 100% solution, partly because of operator error in any human process. There's going to be inaccuracies, partly because the cow still can move, partly because some operators are not well trained enough to know the specific area of the skull where they need to place it. But if it's done right, it works, and the cow is knocked effectively. Not every cow is stunned this way. Some are stunned using electrical current applied to the head, and there's a few other techniques, but captive bolt stunning is far and away the most popular. Once that's done, the animal's unconscious, it's prostrate on the ground, and a shackle is attached to one hind leg. A winch is used to elevate the cow, hang it, suspend it from the ceiling, and then a slaughterhouse worker severs the carotid arteries in the throat, and the cow dies by exsanguination or blood loss. So at that point, it can be butchered. I want to mention briefly that some cows, that's far and away the predominant method of slaughter, but some cows who are slaughtered for the ritual market for the Jewish and Muslim faith have to be slaughtered in a slightly different way. And there's religious law that prohibits adherents of those faiths and a few others from eating animals that aren't slaughtered in accordance with religious dictates. I'm not an expert on why those particular religious prohibitions came about, but the method in both Islam and Judaism is the same. The animal has to be killed by a single cut of a sharp knife across the throat, severing the carotid arteries, and just as a feature of animal anatomy, also the trachea and the esophagus. The most important difference between ritual slaughter and general commercial slaughter is that, at least in the Jewish faith, and according to some but not all Muslim authorities, the animal can't be stunned before it's slaughtered. And the reason for that, as I understand it, is there's a requirement that the animal be healthy prior to slaughter, and there's a feeling that a stunned animal does not comply with that religious dictate. And so in the case of religious slaughter, many or most animals are actually have their throats cut while they remain fully conscious, and even after the throat cut will remain fully conscious, in the case of cows, for somewhere between 15 and 60 seconds, depending on the animal. Pigs are also slaughtered in this country at the rate of about 100 million a year, and there's two principal methods for pig slaughter. The first method, which is an older method and decreasingly common now, is to place a pig on essentially a conveyor system which will carry the pig either usually down into a depressed gas chamber that's filled with carbon dioxide. And the lack of breathable oxygen in the carbon dioxide gas chamber will cause the pig to asphyxiate and die of suffocation. There was some thinking early on that this was not painful for the pig. There wasn't a lot of squealing or aversive reaction, although science now seems to indicate, and there's some sort of brainwave studies in pigs that indicate that for at least some species of pigs, it is a feeling of suffocation while they go through it. Partly for that reason and partly for other reasons, increasingly pigs are slaughtered in the United States using electrical tongs, which are depicted here. And you can't see the worker there very well, but the electrical tongs are actually these giant tongs, and you clamp them onto the pig's head, and an electrical current then spans the brain. And if that current is strong enough, it at least immobilizes the pig. It freezes its muscles so it can be slaughtered, handled safely by the workers. It may or may not render it unconscious, but many experts at least think it do. After the animal's stunned in this way, it's then suspended and stuck or bled in the same way that cattle are, and then processed. There are some welfare concerns about electrical stunning. The first one, which I mentioned, is that it may simply immobilize the animal without rendering it insentient. But a second concern is that there's a lot of room for operator error with this particular technique. The tongs have to be placed correctly, they have to be squeezed tight enough, the voltage needs to be high enough, and if all those conditions aren't met, it won't work completely effectively. And then the last and probably most serious concern is that this is a very temporary stun. Unlike penetrating captive bolt like we talked about with cattle, which actually destroys the brain, pigs will recover in about 20 seconds from this electrical stun. And in many slaughterhouses, studies indicate that it's very common for there to be a delay of more than 20 seconds between the stun and the cut, which means the animal is starting to recover just as its carotid arteries and other features of the neck are severed. I want to talk briefly about chickens, mainly because they're so different from the others, and also because they're so predominant as animals used in agriculture. They too arrive at slaughterhouses by truck in cages, which probably most of you have seen on the highways. When they arrive, they're taken out of their cages and they're immediately shackled upside down, like this, which is stressful for the birds sort of from the get-go, but then they may hang there for a significant period of time as the automated line begins to move. But it's entirely an automated process, poultry slaughter at big plants now. And the first place that they go as the line moves through the plant is to what's called the water bath. And the water bath is a trough of water, and the birds upside down like this are dragged through the trough. And there's an electrical current running through the salty brine in the water bath. And again, it's intended to immobilize the birds and may or may not stun them or render them unconscious, but does immobilize them. One problem with the water bath is that chickens are not all the same size, and smaller chickens or chickens that are particularly feisty or wriggling may not go through the water bath at all. They may twist up out of it, and so they won't be effectively stunned by the water bath. So some proceed without any kind of stunning. The next step for chickens is where their throats are cut, and that used to be a human process. It's increasingly a mechanized process or an automated process. And so they'll go to this mechanical cutting station. But as you can imagine, the chickens that haven't been immobilized by the water bath are terrified of the whirring blade and will twist out of the way of that too. So you will have at least some chickens. I mean, it's a small percentage of chickens, but it's a large number of chickens because there's just so many that are not incapacitated by the water bath and aren't cut by the throat cutter. And the problem then is their next stop, which is after a brief opportunity for the chickens that have been cut to bleed out in what's called the bleed out tunnel. The next stop is what's called the scald tank. It's a pot of boiling water that the line goes down and through. The purpose of the scald tank is to make removal of the feathers easier. But if you're a chicken that didn't get immobilized and didn't have your throat cut, the scald tank is an opportunity for you to drown in boiling hot water. And according to USDA records from a couple of years ago, there were about 3 million birds in America's poultry plants that year that suffered that fate. And the reason we know that is because those birds, they haven't had their throats cut, they haven't bled out. And so when you put them into the scald tank, they puff up and become bright red, and they're called red skins in the trade. And they can count the red skins, and there are 3 billion red skins a couple of years ago. I note that there are some alternatives to this method of slaughter. One of them is called controlled atmosphere stunning or controlled atmosphere killing. And the idea there is that you take the chickens in their crates and you place them into a gas chamber. And depending on the gas mixture that you use, and the research seems to be that argon is the best, the chickens will asphyxiate and die from lack of oxygen, and in a relatively painless way. It's a more expensive process than this process, and so it's not been commercially instituted here, but there are some small slaughterhouses using it. Folks may be wondering, isn't there a law? And there is. The law is called the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, the HMSA, and David and Mariann mentioned it. This is a federal law originally enacted in 1958, and it requires that livestock be slaughtered in a humane manner. And it's got two alternative methods that are called humane. And the first method is if the animal's rendered insensible to pain by a single blow or gunshot or electrical, chemical, or other means that's rapid and effective before being shackled, hoisted, thrown, cast, or cut. And so that's why they use the captive bolt gun on the cattle and they use the electrical stunning on the pigs, is to comply with that subsection A. Then subsection B says, or if you slaughter in accordance with the ritual requirements of the Jewish faith or any other religious faith. So there's a religious slaughter exemption to the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. Another point that I want to make was we're looking at the text of the HMSA is that it applies to cattle, calves, horses, mules, sheep, swine, and other livestock. And that's been interpreted by the USDA, which is responsible for enforcing this, to exclude poultry. So some 95% of all the animals that are slaughtered in the United States each year are not covered by this law or any law as to how they can be slaughtered. They don't have to be stunned. There's no requirement as to how one kills them. In 1958, this was a big deal. This was the subject of a 3-year battle in Congress by animal advocates. The meat industry, through the American Meat Institute, their trade group, fought this tooth and nail. And it's amazing because in 1958, what they were fighting was this regulation, and the sole enforcement was to be, if you didn't kill animals humanely, then the federal government would not buy meat from you. That's it. You just couldn't sell to the feds. But the industry fought this tooth and nail, but they lost. Ultimately, Senator Hubert Humphrey, Democrat from Minnesota and former presidential candidate, was able to push it through partly, and this is amazing to me, partly by having legislators go and visit slaughterhouses and kill animals using the various methods. They actually went, used the captive bolt gun, and assessed the humaneness of different slaughter methods. So anyway, 1958, the legislation passes. In 1978, it's revised, and at this point, almost all big slaughterhouses are using the more humane methods, I would say, the improved methods involving some stunning. And they found that, gosh, it's not more expensive to do it this way, and it's safer for our workers because we don't have struggling animals kicking workers in the head and that kind of stuff. And at that point, industry no longer opposes having this regulation made fully mandatory to every federally inspected slaughterhouse. And so it becomes mandatory, and the Department of Agriculture is tasked with enforcing it. And specifically, that duty falls to the Food Safety Inspection Service, which is you generally think of as the meat inspectors. They're responsible for making sure that your meat's not chemically contaminated and that kind of stuff. And pursuant to this new authority, the USDA passes some regulations, administrative regulations of the type that David and Mariann were talking about in Israel. A couple of points about those administrative regulations. They talk specifically, in some specificity, about how slaughter of various species is to be conducted, and they have general requirements about design of slaughterhouses. You can't have protruding nails in the chutes that the animals walk through and that kind of stuff. But the sum total of these regulations is exactly 6 pages in the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, the meat and poultry inspection process overall takes up 350 pages in the Code of Federal Regulations, but humane slaughter regulations take up 6, so they're pretty sparse. And the second thing I want to say about them is that they're pretty subjective. So for example, they require that animals be handled with, quote, a minimum of excitement. And you're supposed to use electric prods in driving the animals to slaughter, quote, as little as possible. And so there's not much of a bright line. For folks who are charged with enforcing these regulations, they're going to be pretty reluctant to stop the slaughter line, tell the slaughterhouse folks that they're doing something they shouldn't, when all their authority is a minimum of excitement and as little as possible. The third point I want to make about the regulations is that they're not updated very often. So we have all this new science that says carbon dioxide killing of pigs is cruel for at least some breeds of pigs. The scientific evidence is pretty overwhelming. But the regulations were enacted back in the late 70s and early 80s, and they've not been updated to reflect this changing scientific knowledge. And there have been no significant court challenges to the Humane Slaughter Act itself or to the regulations promulgated thereunder. And so I think that I like and appreciate David and Mariann's point that there is some benefit to a regulatory system because it sets up a target for you to shoot at. It sets up regulations that you can challenge and try to get changed. But in fact, in the case of the Humane Slaughter Act in the United States, we've got somewhat of a regulatory system, albeit a very weak one, and nobody's shot at that target. There is litigation pending right now in federal court in San Francisco asking that poultry be included under the Humane Slaughter Act, but for various reasons, which I won't bore you with. I think that's a non-starter. Some state laws have Humane Slaughter Acts. They generally mimic the federal act and don't provide additional protection, which might lead you wondering, and this is the last part of my talk, well, what are sort of the main few problems, and is there some way that we can realistically hope to address these? I want to identify a couple. First one is operator error. No process that involves human beings is any better than the human beings who operate it. And in this case, the slaughter of cows and pigs is incredibly dependent on the skill and ability and focus of the people who stun them. There is no job more important in a slaughter plant from a welfare perspective than the knocker. And the fact of the matter is, turnover in slaughter plants being around 100% a year, that there's no training, virtually no training offered to knockers, and there is none that is federally required. And so problems arise. For example, a recent, it's actually an employment discrimination case about work in a slaughterhouse, but it provided an interesting window into the slaughterhouse world. And there was testimony from a bunch of folks, including managers working at a slaughterhouse, about how the captive bolt gun was actually used to drive and position animals. So you're actually firing the captive bolt into the animal. Or how knockers who were inadequately trained or careless would shoot out the eyes of cattle. Or there was recently a controversy in a ritual slaughterhouse where after the throat cut was made, the slaughterers were actually reaching into the animal's carcass. I guess it was not quite dead yet, so maybe it's not the carcass. But anyway, and pulling out the trachea and the esophagus to facilitate bleed out. And all these things are horribly cruel. Some of them are deliberately so, and some of them through ignorance. But we might try to have a system similar to what they have in the UK, where there's mandatory training and licensure of slaughterhouse workers. It's not an extensive system there, but in order to work as a slaughterer, you need to be certified by a vet who says that you have the necessary skills and training to perform your job in a safe manner. And you have to be licensed by a licensing authority that can reject your license if you've been convicted of an animal cruelty offense or if you have a history of abusing your license and doing cruel work in slaughterhouses. The second main problem is a lack of enforcement. As I said, the Humane Slaughter Act is to be enforced by the Food Safety Inspection Service, which is the meat inspectors, and they've got a job already, which is keeping your food safe to eat. They've got to check E. coli and salmonella and all sorts of contaminants and make sure that animals aren't diseased, and they've got plenty of work to do. And there aren't that many of them. There are 7,500 field workers for the Food Safety Inspection Service, and there are actually 6,200 slaughterhouses and import stations that they need to inspect. So we have just over one worker per facility trying to keep your food safe, and then on top of that, they're supposed to run from the end of the line where the meat's produced to the front of the line where the slaughter's taking place and make sure that that's being done humanely. So the Congressional Research Service says, in typical understatement, FSIS has had difficulty in sufficiently staffing its service obligations. The General Accounting Office says that even when they do document abuses, enforcement is inconsistent. Sometimes the inspector stops the slaughter line, sometimes they don't. They're inexperienced, they don't understand their authority, etc. And maybe more fundamentally, FSIS is trying to be in a cooperative posture with industry and not the police. So what's the solution to this? It might be that it's better to have a separate agency enforcing humane slaughter. It might be that that could be the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. It might be a single-purpose agency for that. Or it might be that we could just have a branch of FSIS do it. But it's clear that a lot of time and money needs to be spent on enforcing humane slaughter if the laws that are already on the books are going to do the work that they are supposed to do. There are many other problems, some of which I'll talk about in my paper, but I wanted to mention last, and certainly not least, the exclusion of poultry under the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. If there were one thing that I could snap my fingers and change, it would be that. And as I mentioned, there's a lawsuit now challenging it, asking that poultry be included. That lawsuit is certain to fail. But it's something that we can change legislatively. And so this has been proposed. In 1993, there was a proposed Humane Poultry Methods of Slaughter Act, which failed. But it succeeded not only in some European countries, or maybe even most EU countries, but also in individual states. Now, state regulations don't mean much because most slaughterhouses are federally inspected, but there are at least two states, California and Indiana, I think, are the two that come to mind, that have humane slaughter laws for poultry. So I think it's something that folks can get behind. I think it's something that would be hard for industry to resist, especially given the success, relative success or non-opposition to the amendment of the original Humane Methods of Slaughter Act in 1978. And I think it's something that is well overdue and would benefit 9 billion animals, so probably something we should think about doing. There are other problems, like I mentioned. The exemption of ritual slaughter and handling in connection with slaughter is one. The existence of these outdated regulations, like the regulations allowing pigs to be slaughtered by asphyxiation in carbon dioxide. And I think some of those are probably ripe for litigation challenges of the type that succeeded in Israel, I think particularly with respect to the pig regulations. But in any event, it's time that we do something or maybe more than one thing to help address some of the problems that I've identified. So thanks.
I want to thank all of our panelists. Before you all leave and put your head in the oven as a result of listening to this, we have time for some questions. Wow. Okay, you.
I know you talked about going state to state and how difficult and expensive and unlikely it is to sort of go and do like legislation bit by bit. And I'm wondering if animal rights people are working on sort of different tacks and, sort of taking different approaches, like maybe trying to reduce the corn subsidies that have enabled some of these huge corporations to become, have a stranglehold on this market and cause meat to be so cheap.
Yeah, work on subsidies is incredibly important. I don't think anybody's really doing it in a focused way. There are both the subsidies to animal agriculture, as you say, the corn subsidies, and in ways that people really don't understand. And also there's work to be done in developing, focusing other subsidies, green subsidies, not that we have very green subsidies, but there are environmental subsidies that could be focused more on humane methods. It's a really, really important area.
So far, there hasn't been like a focused concentration in that area.
Not that I know of.
Not
I don't know
No.
everything that's being done. I mean, HSUS is only starting to get really, really interested in farm animals.
The California lawsuit.
I think it's
Isn't there
important
California
to
lawsuit?
understand how difficult it is to make any changes. One of the things they're talking about the Israeli court decision. There's been a recent challenge from the producers in Israel to that court decision. They're trying to get the authorities, to compel the authorities to test tubes to stick down the bird's throat that are silicone lined, that are more humane. And I know there are a lot of folks in Israel that are worried that that case is going to succeed. And if that happens, then it just eviscerates whatever small victory you've got has just been removed.
I also want to, the other thing that's probably going to happen in Israel is the industry is just going to be moved to Palestinian areas. You can't win.
Sorry,
Right.
But
more depressing.
David, do you want to talk?
I think, I don't know the exact facts. I think there is a case that was brought by, I think it was HSUS in California on taxpayer standing, challenging the giving of subsidies to the poultry industry for the battery cage because the battery cage was cruel.
Actually, a tax break, not a direct subsidy.
Yes, a
But
tax break,
same
right.
kind
So
of,
there is that
thinking.
focus, but there are certainly not the amount that there should be. But it's beginning at least.
Yes.
A question for Jeff Leslie. I see the National Animal ID priority and the Homeland Security Initiative is dovetailing really nicely into your disclosure proposal. Can you comment on that?
Can you say more about how you see it dovetailing in?
I think the path is going to be laid for a barcode traceback to put any type of information that you want to on that barcode, where that cut of meat came from, whether it's grass-fed, who its mama was. We're going to have all that information.
Right. One of the issues in a disclosure process is who is supposed to be doing the disclosure. Is it retailers? Is it producers? I think the best approach would be to have, clearly we need it at the retail level so that consumers can react to it, which is going to require tracing back of all of these things through the supply chain. And ideally, a label would pick up different animal welfare issues all along the supply chain. So you would have disclosures about what happens on the farm, what happens at transport, what happens at slaughter, and that kind of tracing you're talking about would certainly facilitate that.
Yes, in the back.
Me?
Yes.
This goes to the apology about inconsistency that you guys started with. And I'm not a legal scholar, but it seems to me that as long as we have a legal system where subjects either have standing or not, inconsistency is the only way to go. That, I've often thought about the fact that animals sort of occupy the same place in the legal system as the human fetus. It's not it's not fully righted, nor is it unrighted. And how, Roe negotiated that was horribly, ethically inconsistent, but it sort of worked. And don't we need to sort of, rather than apologize for inconsistency, promote it?
Sure. I mean, I'm not sure that I would apologize for it. I just think it's really what I would, the emotion I would like to convey about it is that it's okay. But, it's hard for lawyers. It's hard for lawyers to argue an inconsistent argument. And it's hard for judges. Judges have to dress it up to look like they're following precedent, and it's not inconsistent. I mean, that's basically how things progress. So you can't they don't like to just announce that they're being inconsistent. It kind of destroys the whole illusion.
Well, maybe it's just an illusion.
I mean, and that's actually one of the things we end up talking about or fighting about, was the question of, sort of how honest one must be when one asks for these things. I mean, if you're asking for a prohibition on the gestation crate, and I mean, there's a initiative in Arizona at the moment to ban the gestation crate and the veal crate, and the people who are pushing the initiative are saying that they just want enough space for these animals to turn around, and the opposition is saying, but you really want vegetarianism mandated for everyone, and they go, no, 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 we just want enough space for these animals to turn around. And is that the right way to do it? Is it the wrong way to do it? I mean, these are difficult questions.
Well, thank you very much. We've run out of time. Those of you who are registered, I'm sorry, I really, those of you who are registered are entitled to a vegan lunch. The rest of you, we simply don't care about. So you're on your own.
The luncheon is in the room on this floor. If you're registered, as far as you can go that way. Go that way as far as you can go.
But when I looked up my phone, I realized that
3 states that is active.